Well, here I am again with the third episode. It seems to take an awfully long time to tell, but I'll continue to set the scene. All housework took a lot of doing. In the early years, every floor and any big rug had to be swept with a brush. Tiled and lino floors were also scrubbed with a scrubbing brush. That was a hands and knees job. The small rugs were taken out and shaken every week. Larger ones were taken out less frequently, hung over the clothesline and beaten with a carpet beater to get out all the dust and grime. The carpet beaters we had were woven cane, shaped rather like a clover leaf on the end of a handle. Later Mum had a manual carpet sweeper, of the kind you can still buy today. In the winter, the living room needed a thorough clean every day. Ash and coal dust would have settled everywhere, however careful you were. The grate would be emptied of ash first thing in the morning after it had cooled overnight. Then crumpled newspaper was placed on the grate, sticks layered on top, with a few pieces of coal placed on them. The paper was lit in several places. Hopefully the fire caught, and then more coal would be tipped on. If the wind was in the wrong direction and the fire wouldn't catch, you'd hold a sheet of newspaper across it to funnel air up into the kindling. But be careful! If the draught dragged it in and it caught fire, you had to let go of it pretty smartly. In December we wrote letters to Father Christmas, telling him what presents we would like. We held these just above and in front of the coals, let go of them, and up the chimney they went. Since Father Christmas came down the chimney to deliver the presents, this made perfect sense to us. Every house had a front doorstep, and most a back one too, which would be scrubbed every week, usually on the same day as the drains were cleaned, the grates over the drains being thoroughly scoured as well. We had metal dustbins and there were no bin liners, so the dustbin too needed a regular scouring. Even the draining boards by the sink were given a good scrub every week, being wooden. While she was working, Mum would have the wireless on, mainly music. Her favourite singer was Bing Crosby. I remember Housewife's Choice at 9 a.m. every weekday, Workers' Playtime later in the morning. The latter came live from a works canteen somewhere, supposedly in their mid-morning tea break, and was a half hour of comedy and music. There was a weekly programme of requests called Family Favourites. On a Saturday morning we listened to Children's Choice, a programme of musical requests made by children this time. Family Favourites was Sunday lunchtimes. Dad always worked within cycling distance of home. Every day he came back for his midday meal, which was our dinner. Carol and I, of course, came home for dinner too. Carol, my sister, until we went on the bus to Bedford to school. We were rather spoiled in that Mum always woke us up with a cup of tea in the morning. She boiled a kettle on the stove for tea, and the whistling kettle really shrieked when the steam got going. Tea had to be made in the pot with loose leaves. After leaving it to brew, the tea was poured through a strainer laid across the top of the cup. This caught most of the leaves, but if you drank right to the bottom of the cup, you still got a mouthful of the smallest ones. Ugh! That made you careful. There were no tea bags and of course no instant tea. After our early morning tea we washed, dressed and had breakfast. There wasn't much choice of cereal, none of the sugared flavoured ones until Frosties and Sugar Puffs came along. We had cornflakes, puff wheat, shredded wheat and Weetabix. Porridge maybe in the winter. We had warm milk on our cereal then, although I certainly wouldn't want that now. I used to like Weetabix as a snack, spread with jam. We might have toast and marmalade, which I've always liked, after or instead of cereal. Sometimes it would be bacon or sausages or an egg, not often a combination, with toast and always a cup of tea. If we had a soft-boiled egg, we broke the bottom of the shell afterwards, so that the witches could not ride in it. The superstition was that witches went to sea in eggshells when there was a storm, sank the ships and drowned the poor sailors. We knew it wasn't true, but enjoyed going along with the pretence. When we weren't at school, we would have a cup of milky camp coffee with chicory essence and a biscuit for 11s in the morning with Mum. Coffee had been very scarce in the war, and chicory used as a substitute. Camp, in its distinctive bottle, has a sweetish flavour all its own and indescribable. Coffee and our evening milky drinks were made with equal quantities of milk and water, boiled up together in a pan. In fact, in a small saucepan, with a lip for pouring, that was known as a milk pan. I don't know whether it was partly because sugar was rationed until I was 7 years old, and we craved sweetness, but we all had 2 teaspoons of sugar in our tea and coffee. On the other hand, nearly everyone did take sugar in those days. Uncle Reg had 3 heaped teaspoons of sugar in his hot drinks. We always drank our tea and coffee from a cup and saucer. Uncle Reg would pour tea from his cup into his saucer and drink it from that, what was known as saucering it. This was not considered to be quite polite, but Uncle didn't care. Included in our weekly sugar ration was 2 ounces of sweets per person, as I mentioned much earlier. Our family had 4 separate paper bags of different loose sweets, which were kept in an old metal lunch tin. They all got eaten every week. I think I have probably never consistently eaten sweets in that way since. For dinner we always had a main course and a dessert, known as pudding or afters. I don't know why pudding, because the steamed desserts were specifically known as pudding, as were milk puddings such as rice pudding and sago. We called the latter frogs' eggs because it was just like a cloud of frogs born in the milk, only without the black eye in each egg. Monday was always leftover Sunday roast, often eaten with bubble and squeak, leftover mashed potato and greens mixed together and fried. Sometimes the meat was hand-minced and turned into shepherd's pie, with leftover mashed potato topping. Pudding would be an easy one on wash day. Our usual main course would be meat with potatoes and a seasonal vegetable. Unless we had a stew or casserole, we always had homemade gravy on our dinner. Once a week on a Friday, Mum made fresh fried fish and chips. Oh, no gravy on that either. I'm sure that Uncle Reg, being a butcher, helped with us always having good quality meat to eat. I knew nothing at all of foreign foods until I was well into my teens. The only pasta I ate as a child was macaroni, cooked as a milk pudding and known by us as pipe pudding. I didn't even eat it as macaroni cheese until I had school dinners at Bedford High School. Then came Vesta brand freeze-dried Chinese and Indian meals. They weren't really very good at all, but they seemed quite exotic to us. We ate nothing grilled that I recall other than toast, and in winter we often cooked that and crumpets on a toasting fork over the living room fire. Yum. We didn't have a toaster, just the grill on the cooker. Meat was roasted, stewed, braised or fried. The frying was done in beef lard. We didn't have any choice of cooking oil. We didn't have any choice of cooking oil anyway, in the earlier years of my life. We did use olive oil, but not for cooking. Highly processed, very far from virgin olive oil was bought in small bottles from the chemist, the pharmacy, and used to treat earache. A few drops would be warmed and dropped into the affected ear. It was quite soothing, but I don't know if it did any good beyond that. Healthy eating was never an issue. We simply ate what there was. In any case, nearly all our food was fresh and we had little in the way of snacks. We did eat more fried and fatty food than is now considered good for you, but also a lot of fresh vegetables, with no real junk food. We used up more energy too, not least keeping up our body temperature in the winter cold, but also in walking nearly everywhere, and for us children, playing outside. Mum wore her old clothes and old laddered stockings in the morning to do her housework. She always washed herself well at the kitchen sink after we'd had a cup of tea following dinner and she had washed the dishes. After her wash, Mum changed into good clothes and stockings even if she was not going out. We always had a cup of tea with Mum in the middle of the afternoon that was timed, once we had started school, for just after we got home. Mum might do some knitting in the afternoon, or read her Woman's Weekly magazine, from which she also got some of her knitting patterns, which it still carries. All the magazines were made from thin paper, like newspapers really, for some years after the war, There were no colour pictures in them either. When we were really young, Mum used to read us the very short stories of the Robin family that appeared in every issue of Woman's Weekly. Somewhat to my surprise, the magazine also still has those weekly stories. Our dog Bess always lay at Mum's feet while she was sitting down in the afternoons. As did many dogs, Bess had at least 4 walks every day. One was before breakfast, the next 2 after dinner and tea, and the 4th later at night. It didn't trim her down at all, though. Even though she just had her 1 meal a day and a plain biscuit at night, she was always a fat little dog. On the plus side, her black coat really shone. Mum said that was due to the saucer of tea she gave Bess every morning. And she had the dregs of cocoa at night too. Mum knitted us sweaters and cardigans throughout her childhood. The wool came in skeins, long loops twisted round in sort of figures of 8. To use it, you first had to untwist the skein, then it had to be rewound into a ball. I quite often sat with my forearms straight out in front of me, the skein looped over them and pulled tight. Then Mum took an end and away she went, winding it from the skein into a ball. Then she could start knitting with it. But holding the skein for long did make my arms ache, and they would begin to droop. When we were very young, Mem made our dresses from simple patterns on an old manual Singer sewing machine. In the early days she made all her own curtains too. Even though fabric was still rationed after the war, you could get more for your coupons than you could buy with ready-made curtains. Everyone also darned socks. The area with the hole was stretched over a wooden mushroom, and then you wove with wool of an approximate colour back and forth across the hole with a large darning needle. Men's jackets had the elbows padded with pieces of leather when they became very worn, to make them last longer too. Our old... oh dear, I've lost this a bit. Where am I? Our old cotton sheets were also mended on the Singer machine. As the middle wore out before the sides, so a sheet was cut down the middle and the 2 outer edges sewn together to become the new middle. Got that? What had now become the worn outer edges were then hemmed. This was known as sides to middling. When Dad came home from work just after 5 o'clock, we had tea. This was usually bread and butter with jam, paste from a jar, or cheese in the week. In the winter, as I say, we sometimes had crumpets toasted on a toasting fork over the open fire, or toast cooked in the same way. Then we would have homemade cake. At bedtime we might have Ovaltine, Horlicks or cocoa with a biscuit. There was an Ovaltini's club, and at one time Carol and I had club mugs with red plastic lids shaped like nightcaps to keep the drink warm. Like most mothers then, Mum did not work outside the home. The husband went out to work to earn the money to keep his family. The wife did all the work in the home and cared for the children. This was generally felt to be a fair division of labour, and it was nearly all husband and wife. Hardly any unmarried couples lived together, generally thought of as living in sin. There were also few single-parent families. For one thing, for a woman to have a child out of wedlock was a real disgrace. For another, divorce was very difficult and expensive. There were not the same benefits available as now either, although of course there were some widows and widowers too. Dad, like most working men, had a vegetable allotment. This was a standard size, 10 poles long and comparatively narrow. You can look up the length. He enjoyed working his allotment, which was just as well since it was hard work. It also gave us much needed provisions. Money was always scarce, and so was food in the shops in the early years after the war. And of course, as I've said, a lot was rationed. And now I think I shall leave this for today. And thank you, if you have watched it, for watching. More anon.